I put the casserole dish back in the fridge and sat down at the kitchen table without eating. That was the third night in a row I'd done that. Made something, stood there looking at it and just couldn't. My daughter-in-law had been dropping food off twice a week since the funeral. Good food, real food. She'd leave it on the porch with a note tucked under the lid, something small like, "Thinking of you, Dad," or "Heated at 350 for 20 minutes. I appreciated it more than she'll ever know. But eating alone in a house that used to have 2 people in it is a different kind of hard. Nobody tells you that part. My wife Sandra died on a Tuesday in March. A stroke, they said, fast. She'd been gardening in the backyard, and my neighbor found her when she went to return a pair of hedge clippers she'd borrowed. The paramedics said she probably didn't feel much. I held on to that for a long time. Still do some days. We've been married 38 years. I'm 64 years old. I retired early from the water utility company 2 years before Sandra died. 31 years in operations management. Then a buyout I couldn't refuse. We had plans. A road trip through the Southwest. A cruise she'd been cutting out pictures for since 1997. A vegetable garden she was going to finally do right. We had a whole list on the refrigerator door, held up by a magnet from a trip to Gatlinburg we took in 2009. The list is still there. I can't bring myself to take it down. Sandra and I met in Raleigh when we were both 25. She was a dental hygienist. I was doing infrastructure work for the county. We got married on a Saturday in October in a small church her family had attended for 3 generations. My son was born 11 months later. We named him Philip. Philip is a good man. He's 37 now, works in commercial insurance, lives about 40 minutes away with his wife and their 2 kids. After Sandra died, he called me every single day for 2 months. I told him he didn't have to. He said he wanted to. That's who he is. I also have a daughter, Elaine. She's 34, lives in Portland now, teaches middle school science. She flew back for the funeral, stayed 2 weeks. When she left, she cried at the airport and told me to call her every Sunday. I do. She answers every time. I want you to understand who I was before any of this happened. A man who built a quiet, steady life. A man who thought the hardest thing he'd ever face was losing his wife. I had no idea. It was a Thursday in September, about 7 months after Sandra died. I'd started making myself leave the house by 10 in the morning. My doctor suggested it, not in a clinical way, just practical. Get out before noon, she said. Doesn't matter where, just out. So I'd been driving to a grocery store about 3 miles from the house, picking up a few things I didn't really need, wandering the aisles for 45 minutes, then going home. It sounds pathetic. It probably was, but it worked. It got me out of that kitchen. The store I went to was a Kroger on Henderson Mill Road. I'd been going there for years. Sandra and I used to go on Saturday mornings together, back when that was the kind of thing we did. I was in the produce section squeezing avocados I had no intention of buying, when I heard a laugh. I know it sounds like something from a movie. I know how it sounds. But I heard that laugh and I stopped breathing. It was Sandra's laugh, the specific, particular laugh she made when something caught her off guard, a short exhale through the nose, then a fuller sound that started low and rose. I'd heard that laugh across 38 years of marriage, at kitchen tables and in movie theaters and at family dinners and in the dark when one of us said something funny at 2 in the morning. I told myself it wasn't her. Of course it wasn't. Sandra was gone. I'd identified her body. I'd sat in the front pew at her funeral and listened to her sister give the eulogy. I had the death certificate in a file folder in my desk drawer. But I put down the avocado and I turned around. There was a woman about 30 feet away, standing by the bag salad display, talking to someone on her phone. Her back was to me. Gray hair, cut to her shoulders, the same way Sandra wore hers for the last 12 years. Same height. Same way of standing with her weight shifted slightly to one hip. I told myself to stop it. I told myself I was grieving, and that grief does things to your brain. My doctor had told me that too. You'll see her sometimes, she said. In a crowd, at a distance, it's normal. It passes. I started to turn away, and then the woman reached up to tuck her hair behind her ear, and I saw the back of her left hand. Sandra had a burn scar on her left hand between the thumb and index finger. She'd gotten it in 1991, our third year of marriage, when she grabbed a cast-iron skillet off the stove without a mitt. It left a pale, slightly raised mark about the size of a quarter, irregular at the edges. She'd had it for 31 years. I had kissed that scar more times than I could count. The woman by the salad bags had the same scar in the same place. I stood there for what felt like a long time. My heart was going fast, and I was aware that I was gripping the handle of my grocery cart too hard. I watched her finish her phone call. I watched her drop her phone into her purse. I watched her pick up a bag of salad, check the date, put it back, pick up another one. She moved slowly, casually. She was wearing jeans and a light blue jacket. She had reading glasses pushed up on top of her head. Sandra had reading glasses. She wore pushed up on top of her head. Sandra had reading glasses. She wore pushed up on top of her head. I am not proud of how I handled the next 20 minutes. I stayed 2 or 3 aisles back and I watched her shop. I watched the way she walked. I watched the way she walked. I watched her hands. She stopped in the coffee aisle and picked up a specific brand, Dunkin' Dark Roast, the big container, and Sandra had been buying that exact coffee for as long as I could remember. I watched her stop to let a kid with a cart go past, and she smiled at him, a particular kind of quiet smile, and I thought I was going to need to sit down on the floor. I kept telling myself I was wrong. I kept telling myself this was a stranger with a similar laugh and a scar in a similar place, and that I was a 64-year-old widower in a Kroger having some kind of episode. She went to the self-checkout. I got in line 1 lane over. I was close enough to see her face in profile now. It was Sandra. I sat in my car in the parking lot for 40 minutes. I watched her come out. I watched her load 3 bags into the back of a dark green Honda CR-V. I wrote down the license plate on a receipt I found in my cup holder. I watched her pull out of the parking lot and turn left on Henderson Mill Road, and then I followed her. I followed her for about 8 minutes, staying 2 or 3 cars back the way you see people do in movies, except I wasn't thinking about movies. I was barely thinking at all. I was operating on something underneath thinking. She turned into a subdivision I didn't know well on the other side of the highway. Nice houses, mature trees. The kind of neighborhood where people put out American flags on the 4th of July and hang wreaths at Christmas. She pulled into the driveway of a brick ranch house with a tidy front yard, a basketball hoop in the driveway with no net, a pickup truck parked to the side. I drove past slowly. I didn't stop. I went home and sat in my kitchen for 3 hours. The first person I called was my son. I don't know what I expected him to say. I think I wanted him to tell me I was wrong. I needed someone to tell me I was wrong because the alternative was something I couldn't hold in my head yet. I told him what happened. The laugh, the scar, following her, the house. He was quiet for a long time. "Dad," he said finally, "are you sure?" "I'm not sure of anything right now," I said. "That's why I'm calling you." He drove over that evening. We sat at the kitchen table, and I showed him the license plate I'd written down. He ran it to some website on his phone. I didn't ask how, and after a minute, he put the phone face down on the table. "It's registered to a Sandra Elaine Mercer," he said. Sandra's maiden name was Kowalski, but her middle name was Elaine. My daughter's name is Elaine. Sandra named her after herself. I asked Philip what the address on the registration was. He told me it was the brick ranch with the basketball hoop. Philip stayed until midnight. We didn't come up with any explanations that made sense. He said he wanted to call his sister, but I asked him to wait. I needed a few days. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I brought anyone else into it. I went back to the neighborhood twice that week. I'm not going to justify what I did. I know it was not normal behavior. But I also knew what I'd seen, and I knew that scar, and I knew that laugh, and I couldn't walk away from it. The second time I drove by, I saw her in the front yard. She was kneeling in a flower bed along the front of the house, planting something. She was wearing a green sweatshirt. She had earbuds in. She looked completely comfortable, completely at home. The third time I saw the man, he was coming out the front door as I drove by. Tall, heavy-set, maybe mid-60s, gray beard. He was carrying a toolbox. He walked to the pickup truck in the side driveway, put the toolbox in the back, went back inside. Ordinary. Domestic. I parked down the street and sat there. Sandra had been dead for 7 months. And there she was, gardening in front of a house she shared with a man I'd never seen in a neighborhood 15 minutes from the house we'd shared for 31 years. I hired a private investigator. I want to be clear about why I didn't go to the police first. I was 64 years old, and I just spent 7 months grieving my wife, and the idea of walking into a police station and saying, "I think my dead wife is alive and living in a suburb north of Atlanta," felt like the kind of thing that would result in a welfare check on me, not an investigation. I needed something concrete, something that couldn't be explained away. The investigator I found was named Roy. He'd been doing it for 22 years. He had a small office above a tax preparation service in a strip mall in Chamblee. He was matter-of-fact about everything, which was exactly what I needed. I told him what I needed. I gave him the address, the license plate, the name Sandra Elaine Mercer. I told him about my wife. I told him about the funeral, the death certificate, the stroke. I showed him a photograph of Sandra. He looked at the photo for a long time. "You understand what you're asking me to look into," he said. "I do," I said. "This is going to be uncomfortable no matter what I find," he said. "I know that too," I said. He took the case. It took Roy 11 days. He called me on a Wednesday morning and asked if I could come in. "Not over the phone," he said, "in person." I drove to his office and sat across from him at his desk, and he laid it out for me slowly. The way you give someone bad news when you've had practice giving bad news. The woman living in the brick ranch on Sycamore Trace Drive was Sandra Louise Kowalski, my wife. He had confirmed it with photographs taken over several days, with a partial fingerprint pulled from a coffee cup she'd left at an outdoor table, cross-referenced with Sandra's dental records from her hygienist license, all of which were public record. She had been living at that address for approximately 14 months. 14 months. Sandra had died in March. 14 months put the start of that life at January of the previous year, at the very least, possibly before. The man with the gray beard was named Thomas. He was 67, a retired general contractor, divorced, 2 adult children who visited occasionally. He had purchased the house on Sycamore Trace 3 years ago. Roy had found a marriage license. Thomas and Sandra Mercer had been married quietly at a county courthouse in a neighboring county 11 months ago, 4 months before Sandra Kowalski, my Sandra, officially died. They were married before she died. I sat in that chair across from Roy and I felt something leave my body. I don't know what to call it. Not anger, not yet. Something more fundamental than that. Some basic assumption about my life that I'd been standing on without knowing it, and it was gone, and I was standing on nothing. Roy had more. He'd gone back further, the way a good investigator does, and what he found was that Sandra had started moving money 18 months before her death. Small amounts at first from a joint savings account we'd had for years, then larger amounts from an IRA we'd established together, rolled into an account I'd never seen. Then, beginning about a year before she died, withdrawals from the equity line on our house. In total, over those 18 months, Sandra had moved approximately $214,000 out of our shared finances and into accounts under variations of her name that I had never known existed. She had, Roy told me carefully, been systematically liquidating the financial life we'd built together and relocating it to a life I knew nothing about. I asked him if he knew how she had faked her death, how there had been a body, how I had sat at a funeral. He paused before answering that one. He said he couldn't say for certain, but based on what he'd found, he had a theory. Sandra had worked for decades as a dental hygienist. In that work, she had contact with a wide range of patients. Roy had found records, through sources he didn't fully explain, indicating that Sandra had maintained an unusual and sustained contact with a woman named Ruth, a patient in her late 60s who had no family, no fixed address, and who had been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer approximately 2 years before Sandra's supposed death. Ruth had died, quietly, without family, sometime in late February, about 3 weeks before Sandra's stroke. There was a death certificate for Ruth, but the burial arrangements had been made by a third party. Roy could not confirm more than that, but the timing, he said, was not a coincidence. Someone had been identified as Sandra Kowalski. Someone had been buried in Sandra Kowalski's grave. I don't know how long I sat there. Roy let me sit. He didn't try to fill the silence. When I finally spoke, I asked him one more question. I asked him whether my son had known. Roy set down his pen. He said that over the previous 11 days, he'd observed 2 instances of contact between the woman at the Sycamore Trace address and a man he'd initially been unable to identify. He showed me a photograph. It was Philip. I drove home and I sat in the driveway without going inside. My son, my 37-year-old son, who had called me every single day for 2 months after his mother's funeral, who had come over and sat at this kitchen table and acted surprised, who had run the license plate and told me the name on the registration as if he was learning it at the same time I was. He knew. He had known. I thought about all the phone calls. I thought about him saying, "I just want to make sure you're okay, Dad." I thought about his voice. I replayed it, looking for what I'd missed, and when I found it, the slight flatness, the careful way he'd said certain things, I felt sick. I didn't call him that night. I didn't call Sandra or Thomas or anyone. I sat in my house and I let it settle over me the way you have to let certain things settle. You can't rush it. Some things have to land at their own speed. I called a lawyer in the morning. Her name was Beverly, a family and civil attorney my accountant had used. I sat in her office for 90 minutes and I told her everything, and I put Roy's full written report on her desk, and she read through it without saying much. When she finished, she looked up at me and said, "You need to understand that what happened here was not just a personal betrayal. Several of these actions are criminal." She walked me through it. The financial transfers, fraud, potentially wire fraud, depending on how the accounts were structured. The false death certificate. Roy had told me he believed there had been document fraud involved in the death filing, and Beverly agreed this was likely a serious federal matter. The bigamy. Sandra had married Thomas while still legally married to me, as our divorce had never been filed. Beverly said I had significant options and that the choice of how to proceed was mine. I told her I wanted it all on the table, every piece of it. I called Philip on a Saturday. I didn't tell him I knew. I asked him to come over for dinner. He said yes, the way he always said yes, and he arrived at 6 with a bottle of wine and hugged me at the door, the way he always did. We ate. We talked. He asked how I was sleeping. He told me about the kids. He was so good at it. So natural. I kept looking at him across the table, trying to find the person Roy had photographed, meeting with his mother, the woman I'd buried, the woman who had cleaned out our savings and married another man 4 months before she let me hold a funeral for her. After dinner, I put the report on the table. He looked at it, and then he looked at me, and his face did something I'd never seen it do before. It went still in a way that wasn't calm. It was the stillness of someone who has been caught and is deciding very quickly what to do next. "How long?" I asked him. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute. "She called me about a year before," he said finally. "She said she needed to tell me something. He said she'd told him the marriage had been over for her for years, that she wanted a different life, that she had someone, that she'd been planning to leave, but had found a way that would be cleaner for everyone. She'd asked him not to tell Elaine. She'd asked him to look after me. Look after me, I said. I know, he said. You watched me bury your mother, I said. He put his face in his hands. I'm not going to pretend that conversation was straightforward. I'm not going to pretend I was calm or that I said the right things. I wasn't, and I didn't. I said things I meant and things I probably shouldn't have. He cried. I didn't. I was past crying by that point. I was somewhere colder than crying. He left around 10. I didn't ask him to come back. I didn't tell him not to either. I just let him leave, and I locked the door, and I stood in my hallway for a while. Beverly moved fast once I gave her the go-ahead. The financial fraud case was strong. The documentation Roy had gathered, combined with bank records subpoenaed through the civil proceedings, painted a clear picture of intentional, sustained financial deception. Sandra had moved $214,000 over 18 months using a combination of joint account transfers and equity withdrawals that she had forged my signature on. That last part, the forgery, is what turned it from civil to criminal. The bigamy finding was referred to the county DA's office. The document fraud surrounding the death filing was escalated to federal investigators. I won't pretend I understood every part of what happened legally in those months. Beverly guided me through it. I showed up when I was told to show up, signed what I was told to sign, and let the process do what processes do. Sandra was located and questioned in November. She had, by that point, apparently been told through Philip that I'd found her. When investigators showed up at the house on Sycamore Trace, Thomas answered the door. I learned later that she had not told Thomas about me, not the real version anyway. He'd known she was a widow. He had not known she was a widow. He had not known she was a fraud. That marriage dissolved quickly after that. I felt something when I heard that. Not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of tired recognition. She had done to Thomas what she'd done to me, just in a different direction. The criminal proceedings took the better part of a year. I won't go into every detail because some of it is still legally complicated, and Beverly has asked me to be careful. What I can tell you is that the financial judgment was substantial, and that the forgery charges resulted in consequences that were serious, if not as severe as I'd wanted in some of my darker moments. Elaine found out from me. I called her on a Sunday the way we always talk, and I told her everything. She was silent for a very long time. Then she said, "Dad, are you okay?" I told her I was getting there. She flew back in January. She stayed for 10 days. She and Philip had conversations that I was not part of and probably didn't need to be. The two of them were going to have to work out what they were to each other now, with what they each knew and had done and hadn't done. That was theirs to figure out. She helped me go through some things in the house, not in a clearing out way, just in a practical way, getting some order back. She fixed the handle on the screen door that had been loose for 2 years. She made me go get a haircut. She reorganized the pantry, which she said was an act of chaos. On the last night before she flew home, she asked me if I was angry. I thought about it honestly. I was, I said. I'm not sure what I am now. I think I'm mostly tired, and I think I'm trying to figure out what 38 years means when the person you spent them with was somebody you didn't fully know. She didn't try to answer that. She just sat next to me on the couch, and we watched television, and I was glad she was there. I still go to the Kroger on Henderson Mill Road on Thursday mornings. I still wander the produce section for longer than I need to. I've gotten into avocados, which is something I would not have predicted about myself at 64. I took the list off the refrigerator door sometime in the spring. I didn't throw it away. I put it in a drawer. Some of the things on it, the road trip, the better vegetable garden, I think I might still do. Some of them were hers, and I'll let them stay hers. The magnet from Gatlinburg is still on the fridge. I've left it there on purpose. That trip was real. The years were real, or at least parts of them were, and I'm not going to spend whatever time I have left trying to figure out which parts. That way is a kind of madness, and I've chosen not to go there. My doctor says I'm doing well for the circumstances. She says that like there's a rubric for it, and maybe there is. What I know is this. I walked into a grocery store one Thursday morning thinking I was just getting out of the house the way my doctor told me to, and I walked out of it knowing that the ground I'd been standing on was not what I thought it was. And somehow, in the time since, I've had to build a different kind of ground. Smaller maybe, less certain. But mine, I'm still here. I'm still getting out of the house before noon. Some days that's enough. Some days it's more than enough. I'll take it. I've thought a lot about what it means to be deceived by someone for a long time. Not the kind of deception where someone lies to you once and you catch it. That's painful, but it's clean. You can point to the moment, name it, move past it. What Sandra did was different. What she did required patience and planning and a sustained daily choice over months and years to look at me and let me believe something that wasn't true. That's not a mistake. That's a decision, made over and over again. I used to ask myself what I missed, what I should have seen. I went back through years of ordinary evenings and Saturday mornings at the Kroger and road trips we talked about taking, and I looked for the signs I'd walked past, and I found some. Small things I'd filed away as moods or stress or just the normal distance that settles into a long marriage. I don't think I was blind. I think I trusted. And I think there's a difference even if the result looks the same from the outside. Here's what I've come to understand about trust. It isn't weakness. Choosing to believe the person sleeping next to you is who they say they are is not naivety. It's a reasonable way to live. The failure wasn't mine for trusting. The failure was hers for spending that trust like it was nothing. What surprised me most in the long run wasn't Sandra. It was Philip, because Sandra had already shown me, in the end, who she was. But Philip was my son. I had watched him grow up. I had coached his little league team. I had sat in a hospital waiting room when his first child was born and felt something I don't have a word for, something enormous and quiet at the same time. And he had stood in my kitchen and looked me in the eye and let me believe a lie that his mother built. I don't know if I've fully forgiven him. I'm honest enough to say that. We talk now, carefully, the way you talk to someone when you're still rebuilding the ground between you. He has tried to explain himself, and I have tried to listen, and some days I understand him better than others. What I know is that holding permanent anger toward my own son would cost me more than it would cost him, and I'm too old to pay that kind of price. What I've tried to hold on to through all of it is this. The life I lived was not entirely a lie. The kids are real. The years of work are real. The morning coffee and the broken screen door handle and the list on the refrigerator, those things happened. They belong to me as much as anyone. Sandra's choices don't reach back and erase what was genuinely mine in those 38 years. I think that's what people don't tell you about betrayal at this scale. You spend so much energy trying to figure out what was false that you can forget to protect what was true. And some things were true. My children are true. My own life, the one I built with my own hands and my own choices, is true. I'm 64 years old. I get out of the house before noon. I've gotten into avocados. I'm going to take that road trip through the Southwest, probably in the fall, alone or maybe with Elaine if she can get the time off school. The ground is smaller now, but it's solid, and it's mine.